Hey, good morning, everybody. So thanks for everyone for showing up here. So I'm Dele Atanda. I'm your moderator of this panel. We're going to talk about internet governance and the new social contract. Now, I think the idea of internet governance is actually almost like talking about how do you govern the Pacific. It's humongous. So maybe we can kind of hone that down a bit. And let's look at Internet 2, which is really kind of what this space is about, Web 3. And you know, I often say that the killer application of Internet 1 was the World Wide Web. And perhaps the killer application of Internet 2 is the metaverse. So in order for us to have a productive conversation in a very short amount of time, 30 minutes where we're talking about governance, why don't we start with just running through the panel. If you guys can all introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about yourselves and what you do in the context of Internet 2 and the metaverse. And we can start there. Axel, why don't you start?
Great, thank you. My name is Axel Zubair. I'm Assistant Director of FinTech at the Bermuda Monetary Authority. We are an independent financial services regulator and the only financial services regulator in Bermuda. We're also very pro-innovation and actively dabbling ourselves in the metaverse. That's a little bit about it.
My name is Elizabeth Haas. I teach at NYU.
You might need to talk up just a little bit. Maybe put your mic just a little bit closer.
Is this better?
Much.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Haas. I teach at NYU and work closely with the Conference of Mayors on everything metaverse.
Good morning. My name is David Shin. I'm the head of global adoption for Clayton, which is the only layer 1 blockchain left in Asia, pretty much. We're based out of Korea. We have an office in Singapore. I took a 22-hour flight to get here from Singapore, so it's good to be with you all.
Excellent, and we are really privileged to have such an esteemed crowd. That's a really phenomenal set of perspectives to bring to this idea of governance. So, Axel, why don't I start with you as a regulator? When we look at Internet 1 and Internet 2, what do you think what have we learned from Internet 1? What has worked and what hasn't worked? And what are you doing in Bermuda specifically around regulation for Internet 2 and the metaverse?
Great, yeah, it's a loaded question. I'll start with the latter. So from a metaverse perspective, the answer is really twofold. So we have internal innovation, and we also have the framework that we have in place for the industry. So from an internal innovation perspective, we are actually in the process of recreating our office in the metaverse. We want to reimagine the future of work and the future of play and the future of regulation itself. So we are trying to imagine a future wherein our applicants, our registrants, other regulators are able to collaborate and walk into a BME office, no matter wherever they are in the world, and collaborate together. We also bought a ton of VR machinery and deployed them to various departments for them to tell us what use cases they want to explore and if those use cases make sense for the metaverse. From a framework perspective, we have a framework in place for both digital assets and insurance, wherein we have regulatory sandboxes and an innovation hub, where companies can come in and test their solutions. We're not in the business of telling you how to conduct new market innovation. We have a framework in place that allows us to work with you to figure out what regulation could look like, if necessary, for your model. We also have a broader innovation hub to capture just technology tools. So you can have in-person conversations or conversations in the metaverse with us to talk about the risks related to your business and how that might involve. From the perspective of what we can learn, so in the past, the digital world is not necessarily a new concept, right? We've seen the likes of which in the media, we've seen the likes of which with online gaming, Sims, etc., where we've created entire digital realities where we've purchased digital assets and digital assets for those digital assets and integrated them with traditional payment rails. So that's not new. What we've learned from that also is the community and the forums that develop around that, and how governance itself may work in an environment where there's no governance. So I think we've kind of let the market dictate that. With the metaverse, you're kind of seeing that, but on an exponential scale, where you're also trying to solve for the interoperability of all these digital worlds together. So that's very interesting. I think people always come towards us, especially to talk about, well, what are the risks and how might this metaverse be manipulated? Well, it kind of follows that technology hype cycle, right? So anytime there's a new market innovation, you'll see the innovation itself, you see early adopters, you see early manipulators. Then you'll see the sophistication of all of that and the sophistication of controls in place, whether that be through forensic tools or regulation or self-regulation, whatever makes sense, and then to kind of see if it sustains the test of time. So yeah, it's a little bit about that.
Fascinating, fascinating. Elizabeth, very interested with the Conference of Mayors and then looking at the metaverse particularly. From a regulatory perspective, and no, not from a regulatory perspective, from a governance perspective, how are they thinking about the metaverse, and what are they thinking in terms of the metaverse and cities in that context? Maybe you can give us a little insight around that.
But one of the first mayors that spoke with me about this was the mayor of Arlington, Texas, Mayor Williams. And we were having a long conversation, and he looked at me and he said, governance is not an afterthought. When you set up a new city or a new planet or a new universe, you don't think of government after you set it up. It's fundamental to be built into the design. And you know, that thought, that comment has just stuck with me. And one can argue that in internet, we weren't setting up a verse, and so it came after. But everything that, and there are a lot of lessons we can translate, but we absolutely need to step back with a vision and understand that it's cross-organizational, and to make this work and to make it really be what it can be, we need all of those characteristics. When I talk to mayors, they talk to me at different points. Some mayors are concerned that this is a flattening technology. Industries in their cities are going to be wiped out. What does that mean to them? And how do they help their cities move forward? Some of them, like Mayor Shivi in Reno, who I was with last week, really believes that in the metaverse, and that art is a mechanism for creating communication between people, and that the metaverse can fundamentally facilitate Reno being an art city. And she created city keys that are NFTs and shared them with other mayors. And 13 other mayors are now building their city keys so people can get connected to the community in a different way. So then you look at Seoul, and they say, should we be doing what Seoul's doing, where the metaverse is helping us govern, not governing us? So the answer is there's a myriad of issues mayors are looking at, but they're very fundamental.
Yeah. So, you know, in my work with the Internet Foundation, I've been trying to address policy, regulation, and efficacy. You know, we're fundamentally tasked with achieving digital human rights. And when you look at things like that, you have to look holistically, to your point, and you have to kind of think about, well, what kind of codes do you need to have in place? So we developed this framework that we call a social stack. And it basically assumes that there are 4 levels of code that we need to have. We start with ethics in terms of what is right. And for us, the North Star there is digital human rights. Then that is then underpinned by regulation and law, as in what is allowable, what's legal. Then importantly, next then comes what is incentivized and what is rewarded. So that's economics. What's the economic framework? Then finally is what's possible, which is technology. You know, how do you use technology to enable this stack? So David, the problem that I find though is that quite often the way that we as entrepreneurs and innovators approach innovation is the opposite way around. We start with what is possible. We then try to figure out what is profitable. We then ask, well, is it legal? And it's legal, then to hell with whether it's moral or ethical or not. And I think the evidence of that is in Web 2, where we find ourselves now in this really scary space. You know, we have situations now where you look at Facebook versus the government of Australia. You know, it's not, that's a tier 1 country, if you want to call it that, right? Where Facebook was literally threatening the government of Australia of providing access to what has effectively become a public utility in the country. So, you know, coming back to this issue of governance, right? You know, I would say that if you ask the general person on the street what they think about Web3 and crypto, you know, at least half, if not a lot more, will say scams and, you know, frauds and, you know, money grabbing schemes and all whatnot. And while I understand that the industry doesn't want, you know, we always talk about the pushback of regulation and that regulators are, you know, we are killing innovation. But what are we doing as an industry from a governance perspective? So, and I don't want to put you on the spot specifically with Clayton in that regards, but as an entrepreneur, as someone who is effectively introducing a layer 1 solution, managing a layer 1 solution, the rails of this ecosystem, what do you think we as an industry need to do in terms of governance, and how are you going about that within your organization?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for us, we are looking for projects that focus in on using decentralized technology to incentivize good social behavior. So social behavior is a really important topic for us. There's a real need to try and decentralize the way that Twitter, Facebook manage the interactions that people have, the users have. So for us, you know, we've spoken to different teams about ideas where they're using colored tokens to effectively try and drive good behavior. So if you think about likes and dislikes as colored tokens, like a green token for a like, a red token for a dislike, and you try and use that system to kind of manage behavior online, we think that could be a very interesting tool. So the idea of self-policing through using these tokens to create social credit without having a centralized means to manage that. So we look for teams that are kind of playing with those types of ideas and experimenting with those concepts.
That's really good because, you know, sure, please.
Can I add just something to that?
Please.
You look at some of the things that are happening with police forces right now. One of the things they're doing is they're quick polling neighborhoods on do you trust your police? And then the police are going out there and trying to build trust, because police are pretty crappy communicators. But they're going out there and then they're measuring is trust better. And so for every neighborhood in the city, they can measure trust at any moment in time. And I actually think something like that might complement the tokens.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really like that approach, and it's something that, you know, I've done some work around that, because I think reputation management is a really important way to manage behavior. And definitely, I think something that is not really explored enough in this space is that one of the real key superpowers of crypto is this ability to design behavior incentive systems where you can really put into play, where you can incentivize outcomes, social outcomes, intention. You can experiment around getting positive social outcomes. But I think the challenge is that, you know, quite often we're not rewarding those and not focusing on those aspects themselves in terms of generating those social outcomes. But and that's quite often because a lot of the focus of the space is primarily still on money. It's still on, the industry was born out of a financial asset, Bitcoin effectively, right? And that's cool in many regards, but we're getting to a point now where this technology is bigger than the financial system. It's encompassing our democratic foundations, as we saw with January 6th, for example, and the role that social media played in that cannot be overstated. So there is, but I stress this because I think this industry, this crypto, Internet 2, Web3 industry, is the next wave of the internet.
One thing I want to add, just with that concept, you can tie it into even managing scams. Because a lot of scams are happening online through Twitter, social media. And so through sort of online societal policing and having sort of create this community awareness through this token concept, green and red, I think you can really kind of sift through those projects that people feel are scams versus not. So it's not a silver bullet, but I think it highly can mitigate some of the risk.
I completely agree.
To add a point as well, I think generally there's a lot of focus in the crypto space and even in the metaverse right now in relation to blockchain. There's just a lot of focus on the what, and we just need to create solutions for the sake of solutions without figuring out what is it that we're even trying to solve for. So before getting into how do we govern, how do we make this scale, how do we actually get people involved? Exactly. What is it that we're actually trying to solve for?
That's a really good point. I want to, sorry, go ahead, Liz.
I was going to say the interoperability in the metaverse also is a different kind of challenge that this fits, in the sense that trust doesn't end when you leave my site.
Yes.
Because you're going everywhere. And so we need something that's universal, because it's an ecosystem and it's a verse, not a site.
I agree completely. It touches on, there's a very important point that the token, a reputation token, is very material to. And it comes down to this thing about identity. Because one of the big, I think, generally speaking, when you look at governance and you look at policy, it's always about balancing the need of the collective, which is the state represents, versus the need of the individual. And this is a really delicate balance that we negotiate through a democratic process in terms of where we draw the line, where we take the scale on this. And if you take, for example, the classic example of privacy, the need for anonymity to preserve privacy in digital world versus the need for identifiability with KYC, AML to prevent financial crime, for example. So reputation tokens become a really important way where you can have accountability but still retain privacy. And so, but what the challenge there is really about having a really robust identity framework, and one that's smart enough to be able to move through those different permutations and circumstances. So Axel, I wanted to kind of ask you a bit about this, because I was really impressed listening to your premiere yesterday, talking about a lot of the work that you guys are doing around identity. And just to caveat how you address that as well, I do feel, when I say that we're going beyond money, it's data, right? And while, I often say, while all money is data, not all data is money. And data is a bigger problem than money in that regard. So I just want to kind of get a sense of what you guys are doing on the identity side, and what your vision is, and what you're hoping to achieve with your identity innovations in Bermuda.
Yeah, identity is definitely being explored in the jurisdiction. We have many companies come to us trying to understand how to faster onboard new participants. So we're creating a framework in collaboration with multiple parties, open for consultation around what the future of identity could look like, and whether there can be reliance placed on other parties for and in terms of identity providers. But interesting in the concept of identity, when you're talking about the digital verse, it's I mean, in the likes of Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc., we've seen a mass surgence of consumers give up identity, demographic, all types of data for ease of operational efficiency, ease of access, and that's not something that we ever told them to do, especially as regulators. We were just like, if you can provide this data if you want, but let's make sure that the data that's being provided is secure. The way that you're protecting your consumers is secure. So in the metaverse, when the data is then secured by blockchain technology, you can then control where your data is actually going and what types of access that you want to have to particular platforms and what access you want to give them to your identity data.
Which is a really exciting proposition in that regards. Okay, let's move on a little bit.